want to thank Wendy for her very comprehensive presentation on what's been tried before. So we're not in new territory. This is not my first time being involved in thinking about structures focused on the future and looking and planning for a different tomorrow. Let me give you just a short history to put that into context. I was first elected to Parliament way back in 1972. The young ones should remember that. But the Norman Kirk-led Labour government went on to claim a big victory that year and formed the government. The new Labour government was very soon confronted with the first oil shock, which New Zealand was unprepared for. As an aside, just to remind you, New Zealand's oil bill increased from only $66 million, think of that in 72, to $550 million only 5 years later, in 77. Watching this turmoil, some of us in the National Party decided that New Zealand needed to have some mechanism and structure charged with the responsibility of looking further out into the future in developing policy. And on winning in 1975, the national government, as you've heard, established both the Planning Council, which had then a 5 to 10 year time horizon, and the Commission for the Future, which sought to determine longer term trends and options. Wendy has covered some of that material, and others on the panel are more able to discuss the operation of the Commission and how it might have influenced policy and what might have been done differently. In the nearly 50 years since 1972 election, other voices, young voices, are demanding action. The 16-year-old Swedish activist Greta Thunberg's message to the UN Conference on the Environment earlier this month in New York was blunt and directed at current leaders. She said thus, "People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of mass extinction, and all you talk about is money. You are failing us, and the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of future generations are upon you." She went on, "We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now, is where we draw the line. The world is waking up," she declared, "and change is coming, whether you like it or not." That was the powerful, blunt message that Greta Thunberg delivered to the UN in New York. I agree with her that radical new thinking is required in many areas, but especially as it relates to how work and reward is organised, and how to put respecting the fragility of Mother Earth at the centre of all public policy. Remember that Mother Earth doesn't need us humans, but we very definitely need Mother Earth. Back in New Zealand in 2014, two young women, Lee Bell and Waimarama Anderson, at that time aged 15 and 16 years, pupils of Otahonga College in the King Country, mounted a petition that was subsequently presented to Parliament, asking for nothing more than that an honest history of New Zealand's colonial period as it related to the land wars be taught in all schools. Last month, the Prime Minister announced that the national curriculum will be updated to ensure all pupils are taught key aspects of our history. I totally agree with that decision, and of direct relevance to any thinking and planning for the future. It is important that we also have knowledge of and a clear understanding of our past, the good and the not so good. We also need a clear understanding of the current mood and sense of fairness, or is it unfairness, across society in many countries, including New Zealand. Just this morning, those of you listening to international media, and it reported that the Prime Minister of Lebanon had resigned, in effect forced out of office by protesters on the streets. Respected commentator Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Columbia University, New York, 8 days back, raised the question why rich cities rebel. He was, of course, referring to the ongoing violent protests in Hong Kong, Paris, and San Diego. Professor Sachs advanced a number of reasons for widespread dissatisfaction. I will quote a couple. He states that, ironically, Hong Kong, which some surveys show, quote, as having the most economic freedom in the entire world, yet Hong Kong citizens despair of their freedom to choose what to do with their lives. In all three countries, urban young people, he stated, not born into wealth, despair of their chances of finding affordable housing and a decent job. Sound familiar? Further, he adds, perhaps most important and least surprising, is that traditional economic measures of well-being are wholly insufficient to gauge the public's real sentiments. I again strongly agree. Remember that the current measure of progress, GDP per capita, measures an economy's average income, but say nothing about its distribution or people's perceptions of fairness or injustice. We are simply not measuring what's important. Back in May this year, I attended a conference of the Interaction Council, which is a meeting of former presidents and prime ministers in Cartagena, Colombia, where I moderated a panel which discussed the hugely important question of what should replace GDP as a measure of human progress. I was given the task because at the previous conference in Beijing, I stated bluntly that GDP should be dumped. Clearly, GDP, which has been used as a measure of progress for the last 80 years, needs to be replaced with a much more inclusive metric. Put simply, if we are not measuring what really matters to citizens, then the measurement is worse than useless because it could take policy down a totally blind alley. The good news is that work has been done in this space. Take the goal of sustainable development, which were reflected in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals adopted by world governments back in 2015. Those goals move way beyond traditional measures to set a much richer set of objectives, including social fairness, trust, environmental sustainability. Economic growth, I suggest, without fairness and environmental sustainability is a recipe for disorder, not well-being, as we see reflected in the protests across the world. The objective of creating a fair, equitable and inclusive society is what we should focus future planning on if we want an open and enjoyable society. One of today's major concerns is the fear that artificial intelligence, AI, will destroy millions of jobs. Let me say up front that AI will destroy millions or radically alter millions of jobs. I don't fear new technology. What I fear, what I suggest you should fear, is old thinking and old attitudes which could deny or delay the world community, including New Zealand, of many of the benefits that machines driven by artificial intelligence, including self-drive vehicles, could deliver. Just recall that on Monday, not that far back, we had a day off to celebrate Labour Day, a day that recalls the permanent introduction of the 8-hour day and the 5-day week. We take it for granted now. Yet it was hugely controversial when first talked about and introduced. Looking forward, and because of new technology like artificial intelligence, we should be at the early stage planning for the introduction of a 4-day working week. Instead of bemoaning the fact that modern technology will alter the workplace, we need to be planning as to how we will gain maximum benefit from such developments, and note, most importantly, how those benefits will be shared across society. There's work to be done, as I haven't heard a single politician discuss these issues. All attitudes were clearly in play when the current government considered and rejected a recommendation supported by their own Ministry of Transport to ban the importation of fossil fuel vehicles from 2035 onwards. Radical. Fact is that France, the United Kingdom, Scotland, Norway, Holland and Germany have all put in place requirements for new cars to be emission-free or low emission by dates varying from 2025, which is virtually 5 years away, and 2040. This proposal, however, was apparently too radical a step for what I term the old thinking of some inside the New Zealand government. Such thinking needs to change, must change. Let me conclude by repeating that any new attempt at planning for the future needs to focus on changing attitudes and changing thinking, changing hearts and minds, if it is to make a material difference. That's more important than the structure. Recall, we have celebrated in recent days the fact that we're going to teach an honest history. A no-brainer, you say now. Yet when the two young high school girls presented their petition only 3 years back, in March 2016, the reaction was to refuse to include the New Zealand wars in the curriculum. So then Secretary of Education, Peter Hughes, might be in the audience, in a written submission said, quote, that requiring schools to teach a specific subject would be contrary to the spirit and underlying principles of the curriculum, end quote. In planning for the future, such attitudes must change, whether it's regarding history or the latest piece of transforming technology. And for that to happen, citizens, you, need to feel involved and to be involved. What is required is that we create an environment that encourages all to be open to new ideas, for without new ideas, the people will perish. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer questions.